Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Spooky Feeling by Anonymous. I worked for a fire department that had lost a few members in its time. Over the course of the few months that I was there, I noticed strange noises in the bay. Once, I walked in the front door only to hear the back door slam. So I walked back to see who it was, and when I opened the back door, no one was there. There was fresh snow on the ground, and no tracks. Another time, I went down to the bay in the middle of the night, and I heard distinct footsteps walking around one of the rigs on the other side of the bay. I called out, but no one answered. I was spooked and crept around the bay with an axe trying to find the intruder, but there was no one there. I always got a really spooky feeling anytime I was alone in the bay or by the back door. Later, I happened to mention to the chief that I had heard some weird stuff in the station at night. He got a look on his face and said, "Let me guess, footsteps behind engine 3? And maybe a creepy feeling by the back door?" Yeah, I also got the same story from one of the captains. They had all heard footsteps and everything else I had experienced. Well, it never hurt us or harmed us, but I guess someone's still hanging around. Firefighter Nightmare, submitted by Jody G. I've been a volunteer firefighter in a rural farming community for just under 16 years. There's a semi-major highway that runs through my township between two cities, so I've seen my fair share of MVCs, car wrecks for those not in first responder fields, minor wrecks, and people having panic attacks because their parents are going to be mad, to 3 or more cars mangled beyond recognition, bodies on the ground just as mangled as the cars, and police, firefighters, and EMTs scurrying around like ants performing their tasks to try and save lives. After all of these years of being on, I've become pretty much numb to the sights and sounds of death and the sadness that comes with the job. But my story starts in the middle of May, on my 30th birthday. I had gone to my day job like I had every day for the past 5 years. I'd felt off all day, but shrugged it off, just thinking, well, I'm not in my 20s anymore. At that point, I wasn't concerned about going out with friends to celebrate. I'm way too old to be drinking all night anymore, I laughed to myself. I left work and went to my station because I had to work on the water pump of one of our grass fire trucks. It was starting to get dark and I was picking up my tools when I heard my department radio squawk, making me jump for the fact that the county had been quiet. The voice on the other side came out, "Injury accident with entrapment and possible ejection, District 3. I immediately grabbed my portable radio and 10-4'd the page. 309-10-4, Squad 3 en route, crew of 1. The wreck had happened on a very notorious set of curves on the highway, a little over a mile as the crow flew from my station. I knew I'd be there in minutes, but with the uneasy feeling I had, it felt like forever. I arrived on the scene and gave my scene info to dispatch and the other incoming units. Squad 3 on scene, single vehicle rollover with partial ejection. 309 will be incident command until Chief 3 is on location. Have med flight on standby. There were a few people standing by the car trying to pull a young woman out. She was in her late 20s, I'd say. I told them to step back and leave her as she was. And then I checked for a pulse, despite being able to see 2/3 of the inside of her skull. Her brain was shattered along with parts of the dash, windshield, and cornfield. I radioed in. 309 to EMS, 1 obvious code black. I looked around inside of what was left of the car, and I saw what was left of a kid's meal in the back seat next to a booster seat. After seeing the food and that seat, I thought to myself, oh, please, God, no. I had the flashlight on my helmet, and I turned my other light on and started to search the field after making sure the car wasn't going to explode. I looked at where the car came off the road and how it rolled, and I walked the way I thought something would have gone due to physics. I got about 50 feet away from the car, and I saw a small mass in the corn stubble. I got closer and saw that it was a little girl, about 6 years old, face down in the dirt. I gently rolled her over, controlling her C-spine to mitigate any more damage if she was alive, and I got her rolled over and saw the color was almost gone from her face. I checked for a pulse, and she was gone. I felt like I just wanted to burst out sobbing, but I heard my chief and others arriving on scene, so I composed myself and gave my report and command to my chief. He saw how distraught I was just by looking in my eyes, and told me that I was relieved for the night. I went home, but there was no sleep for me, because I kept seeing that little girl in my mind, and the thought that I couldn't do anything to save her. Morning came fast, and I went to work, the incident from the night before still on my mind. When the workday was done, I stopped at the liquor store for the biggest bottle of whiskey and the pharmacy for the highest strength of melatonin. I got home, sat in my chair, took a handful of pretty much sleeping pills and a big drink of whiskey. Half an hour later, I was nodding off, but all of a sudden I was jolted awake by the sound of my radio squawking. "Welfare check, District 3. I fully opened my eyes and the smell of badly decaying body hit my nose, and I saw I was in a dark house, my radio still squawking away, but I couldn't fully understand what was being said, and then it just went to static. I recognized the house. It was from the first suicide I had worked on while at the fire department, my first year on. A young man was heartbroken by the first love of his life leaving him, and he sat in a hot bath and opened his veins with a razor. I was all alone in the house calling out, "Fire department, we're here to help. Call out if you can." But I got no response. The smell got stronger the closer I got to the bathroom. I opened the door and almost vomited. There in the tub was the young man, bloated from days of long being passed on and absorbing the bathwater. I radioed that he was code black, but all I got was static. And just then, I heard gurgling coming from the man. I stepped closer. He reached out and grabbed me, trying to pull me into the tub with him, all the while with a drowning, gurgly voice saying, Why didn't you save me?" Then, just before my head went under the water, I woke up to my alarm. I got up and went to work and repeated the process again the next night. Whiskey and melatonin when I got home. That night, I was actually able to go to bed and fall asleep, too tired to even really think about the crazy dream from the night before. As I was laying in bed, I woke up just enough to smell smoke. I fully opened my eyes, and I was in the back of our fire engine with an air pack on. I got out of the truck to the site of a 2-story farmhouse with heavy smoke and moderate fire showing. The next department chief turned to me and said, "Neighbor reports that he's unsure if the family that lives here is inside or gone. Take a few guys and do a quick search and update the conditions of the house." I grabbed another guy that was packed up with tools, and we made entry before the hose lines were deployed and charged. We searched the entire bottom level of the house and found the pet dog. The poor thing had passed from smoke inhalation, and we started to make our way up the stairs, and command radios to us through the broken static. "Command team, report, second floor, Delta side, bedroom." The extreme heat and smoke was making radio communications almost useless, but we were able to make out enough that my partner and I knew where to search. I was in front, just getting to the top of the stairs, when I heard the creaking of wood, and then, with a loud crack, the stairs collapsed. I yelled to my partner to check on him, and he yelled back that he was all good, but unable to follow me. I proceeded down the smoke and fire-filled hallway to the bedroom that Command had said the possible victim was in. I got to the door, and it was shut, and I checked the door, and there was a lot of heat behind it. I turned around and mule-kicked it by jumping behind the wall in case of a backdraft. I went in and saw someone on the bed burning. I got halfway in, and the person on the bed sat upright, screaming, and then rushed at me. I was still being on my hands and knees. The victim stopped in front of me, face to face, and I could see into what was left of a woman's eyes. Her face was badly burnt, with crispy flesh falling from her cheekbones. In a dry, raspy, crackling voice, she croaked out, "Please, help me." I was frozen in fear, staring back at this woman that should have been passed out at a minimum from the extent of her burns. I started to open my mouth to say, "Okay, let's go." But just then, as clear as day, I heard from my radio, "Command to all fireground. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Structure collapse imminent." I looked back up, and the burned lady was gone, and the floor gave way, dropping me to the basement. Just as I hit the floor, I was jolted awake. I was in my own bed, and it was 3 a.m. I stayed awake the remaining 4 hours until it was time for me to get ready for work. But between me and the walls, work wouldn't like the idea of me drinking whiskey all morning before shift. And I got to work, and I had this constant uneasy feeling as I pulled into my parking spot. On my day job, I work as a tire tech mechanic for the city, so I'm around a lot of dangerous things all day. I was airing up a tire that I had just fixed, and I was half asleep, so I didn't hear the popping coming from the side wall of the large dump truck tire a foot away from me. I felt a small tug at my untucked work shirt, and that was enough to cause me to lose my balance and fall to the ground right as the tire exploded, sending dust and pieces of tire flying. I looked up and saw the dusty, blurry image of a small girl in front of me. I shook the disorientation from my head and the dust from my eyes and looked for her again, but she was gone. The guys in the main shop had heard the explosion, and the manager saw it happen on the camera system. They all came out to check on me, asking if I was okay. I said, "Yeah, I think so, but where did the little girl go?" The manager asked, "What little girl? It was just you out here." So I got taken to the hospital to get checked out, not mostly because they thought I was concussed, but because I asked about a kid in a city fleet garage. As I was laying on the hospital bed in the emergency department waiting to be seen by doctors for that possible concussion, I started to hear sirens outside, and I knew it was an ambulance bringing someone in hot. My room was right across from the ambulance unloading bay, so I saw it pull in, and then it was followed by nurses and doctors rushing to the big sliding doors. I saw the ambulance doors fly open and the guys pull a stretcher out, and on that stretcher was a small red mass towards the head of the gurney, covered in EKG electrodes and an IV bag. They wheeled the gurney past my bed, and I could see that it was a little boy, pretty banged up. My head started to spin, and my stomach knotted up. I reached for the little trash can next to my bed and threw up what contents were still in me. The nurse that stepped into my room to get out of the way of the huddled mass of firefighters and medical staff asked if I was okay, and I replied, "Yeah, I've just seen those lights so many times before." Just as the nurse was going to ask what I meant, we both jumped at the next sound we heard. The mother in the back of the ambulance. The only way I can describe that sound is haunting. A mix of a deep wail and moan with screams for her baby boy. The nurse was frozen in fear, and my blood ran cold as security was helping the woman who was banged up as well. I'm assuming this was all from a car wreck. As the woman in security got near my room, she let out another soul-shattering cry, "Please save my baby!" and she stumbled through the doorway of my room, collapsing on the floor. My first reaction was to jump and help her, so I took her up off the floor, and she started crying on my shoulder. My many years in the department kicked in, and I did my best to console her. And then doctors and security came in and helped her to a room where her son was. A few minutes later, I heard her wailing down the hall the words, "No, please bring him back!" That was echoing throughout the emergency department and into my mind and soul. I got checked out and was sent home for the rest of the day with a clear from the doctors, my mind still replaying the sound of the grief-stricken mother crying for her son, who sadly didn't make it. As I was driving home thinking of everything that happened throughout the day, whatever it was that pretty much pulled me away from the exploding tire, seeing a little girl that I swear almost looked like the one I found in the field a few nights prior, and the feeling of the sheer pain and sadness from the mother in the ER. It was overwhelming. I got home around 3 p.m. and was truly exhausted, so I laid down for a nap. Even though the dreams I had previously had were on replay in my mind, I started to doze off until my fire radio toned out for a car wreck just down the road from my house. This time, it wasn't a dream. I went directly to the scene in my personal truck, which has emergency lights. I got to the wreck and radioed in 309 to dispatch, 2-vehicle non-injury, no entrapment but heavy debris and road blockage. Needs quarter-unit mile north and south of intersection to slow traffic. I instructed those involved to get to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by another vehicle. But just then, I felt a cold hand in mine and heard a small voice say, "Behind you." As I turned and looked, I saw a car going way too fast coming directly at me. I jumped and rolled into the ditch as the other car crashed into the two others. And hours later, after the wreck was cleaned up, I finally got back home. My mind and body were so battered over everything that had happened over the past couple of days. I turned off my radio and phone. I sat in my chair with my pistol in my right hand and a bottle of whiskey in my left. And with every drink, I built up the courage to do the cowardly thing and take my life. The horrible things I've seen and heard had finally taken their toll on me, and I wished for the pain and doubt to end. I took one more big swig of whiskey and lifted the gun to my head and started to squeeze the trigger. And that's when I felt a small, warm hand where the cold metal should have been. I opened my eyes, and there the little girl from the field had her little hand against my head blocking the barrel. She asked why I wanted to do this, and I said I can't deal with the lives I wasn't able to save. More so yours. I'm sorry I couldn't save you or your mother. She just smiled a little and said, "But you tried. You gave your all in doing so. And if you do this, you won't be able to save others who can be saved." Hearing her words, I dropped the gun and whiskey and started to cry. The cold emptiness I'd felt now turned to warmth and hope. I sat there for a while and turned my radio on, and it went off again. Mutual Aid for Mass Casualty, MVA, District 3. I turned and looked to the little girl, and now she had a glow to her. She said to me, "Others need your help. Show the strength and dedication you showed when trying to save me." I stood up and grabbed my radio and turned back to find the little girl gone. I looked around and she was nowhere to be seen, but I felt as if the world had been lifted off of my shoulders. I keyed up the mic on my radio and said, 309-10-4 en route direct POV. Now, to this day, I'm not sure what all happened. Was I having a mental breakdown and seeing the girl was my mind's way of correcting it? And the incidents where someone or something intervened was just me misreading my second nature? Or had there actually been a little angel watching over me? The Worst Thing by Stanton N. This incident was the one that finally drove me over the edge and made me realize I couldn't do the job anymore, at least not as a frontline firefighter. On that day, we were dispatched to a report of a fire at the local crematorium. Yuck yuck, irony aside, we used to get these quite often when they'd essentially get a chimney fire above the furnace. It's sort of gross, but we handled those pretty easily by dropping a few chimney bombs and perhaps spraying a little water. But this one was different. As we pulled up to the building, we noticed there was no smoke coming out of the chimney, but there was light smoke coming out of the crematorium building itself. We were met by an employee who told us he didn't know what was on fire, and he couldn't find the source of the smoke. We, of course, asked if they had anybody in the furnace, and he said no, they hadn't cremated anyone in about 4 days. I personally checked the furnace, and it was indeed cold. No fire there. The light smoke smelled distinctly like bacon, and I asked the employee if they had a staff kitchen somewhere or whether someone had been cooking. He said no. So we kept investigating the source of the smoke, looking in all the rooms and closets and crawl spaces. We looked for over 20 minutes and couldn't find anything. I was back in the furnace room after that 20 minutes just to double check it. I was about to call on the radio to the battalion chief that I was about to give up as we couldn't find anything. But just as I was about to leave, I saw a previously unnoticed door or hatch directly below the furnace. The furnace had a small stairwell descending along one side of it that led outside. I opened it up, and stronger smoke charged out, and I could see a faint flicker of a flame in the back area of what looked like a large crawl space. I'd found the fire. I put on my air pack mask and got on the radio and told the battalion chief to bring a hose around at the back door. We'd found a small fire, and my partner and I were going in to investigate. What we found was actually a pretty small fire seemingly burning on the dirt of the crawl space. I mean, what the heck was the fuel? It was dark under there, and with all the smoke, we really couldn't tell what the fire was burning. It was just dirt and brick under there. There shouldn't have been anything to burn. The guys finally shoved a hose into us, and we quickly put the fire out. And the guys on the outside also found a crawl space vent that they opened so we could finally get some daylight in there to see what we were dealing with. I distinctly remember mentioning to my partner that I still couldn't figure out what had been burning. That was when we looked around the crawl space and realized that the dirt floor had large pools of what looked like a black tarry substance. It was the black tar that had been feeding the fire. We'd also been crawling through this stuff while trying to put out the fire, and we were now covered in it. We looked above our heads and realized that we were directly below the brick-lined furnace. So what was on fire? What was that black tar? It was basically about 100 years, that's how old the crematorium was, worth of rendered fat from bodies being cremated that had seeped through the brick lining and wound up on the dirt floor of the crawl space. Over the decades, it had accumulated in large pools beneath the furnace until one day, something, which we never figured out what, set it on fire. I mean, being rendered fat, it burns just like fat does if you catch grease on fire on your stove. It's also why it smelled like bacon. I came to the horrifying realization in about 10 seconds, and my reaction was made worse by the other realization that I was covered in this stuff. Literally, from head to toe, covered. I yelled to my partner that I needed to get out, now, and he barely had time to ask what's wrong before I pushed by him to get outside. I started screaming that I had to get my gear off, and I started just stripping down in the yard and throwing my equipment off me. The guys outside thought maybe I was being burned, and they started helping me, and it was only then that I collapsed in tears and told them what was on fire and why I wanted to get my gear off. That was my career-defining moment as a firefighter. At that point, I'd been doing it for 20 years. I'd seen some really nasty stuff over those decades. Homicides, drug overdoses, dead kids, domestic violence, you name it. I somehow found a way to build a wall up against all of that stuff and soldier on. That was until that day when a fire in a crematorium broke me down. Sitting there half naked in the grass outside that crematorium, I realized I wasn't cut out for the job anymore. If I went into one more fire or went on one more ambulance call, I probably would have had a nervous breakdown. I didn't quit right away, and I eventually had to go on some more fires and ambulance calls after I returned from taking some mental health leave. But it was that call at the crematorium that prodded me to finish my management degree and make sure I got a job off the front lines as soon as I could. First Fire by David S. I was on an overnight tour, asleep in the upstairs bedrooms, when at 1 a.m. the tones in the station went off. Everyone there jumped up and headed to the truck. And because the brain boots up slower than the physical body, I barely recall another firefighter saying it was a structure fire as we made our way downstairs. This was going to be my first fire. I got down to the bay, donned my turnout gear, and boarded the engine. The address came across the radio, and I became more alert, and we were responding to my address, a high-rise condo building. My phone was in my station uniform pants and impossible to reach while fully dressed in SCBA and seated on the engine. I wanted to call my wife, who was home with the dog. I did manage to get my phone once I took a break and saw my wife had texted when she went out with the dog around 1:30 a.m. All it said was, OMG. In minutes, we were turning onto my street, and I could see the intense flames. But I immediately realized it wasn't my 11-story building on fire, but a single-family home on the street in front of our parking lot. The address given on the radio was from where witnesses were calling 911 from. It was surreal. I had passed that house about 6 hours earlier on my way to the firehouse. I watched that house go up, saw the family of 5 move in just 4 months earlier. I walked my dog in the field beside it 3 times a day, and I waved to the homeowners who were on their deck or in the pool whenever I saw them. My neighbors. The engine stopped and I jumped off, went to the back and grabbed the 5-inch hose. It took 4 minutes to find a hydrant which was hidden under a severely overgrown bush with thorns and covered in vines wound around it. Thank goodness for thick structure gloves and turnout gear. But once tapped, I joined my crew. It was a long night fighting that fire. December 8th, 2019, just days before Christmas. I live in a beach town. We get about 5 good fires a year with a lot of medicals, alarms, and lift assists. We learned that the cause of the fire was a grill set into a wooden housing that caught fire due to radiant heat and just the right breeze. Yeah. In 2020, they bulldozed the remains of the house and cleared the lot. You'd never know it was there. But I knew it was once there. I mean, those were my neighbors. They say you'll always remember your first fire. I assure you, I will always remember mine. They All Knew Him by Ida K. My husband is a lifetime member of a local volunteer fire station in Baltimore County. He wasn't volunteering on the day that this call happened, but the event affected his entire station house for years. My hubby's volunteer firehouse is situated directly across the street from a high-speed Amtrak train line, and one day, their station got a call for a person that had been hit on the tracks. The station emptied out and responded to the call. They arrived to discover that the person had decided to intentionally end things by getting run over by a train. The victim laid his head down on the tracks, and you can imagine the rest. Unfortunately, the train engineer couldn't stop in time, and I can only imagine the trauma that he suffered from that. The body of the young man was pretty much unidentifiable except for one item. He was wearing a pager, and it was going off. The first responders realized that it was a fire department pager, and it was alerting for the very call they were already on. That's when the gruesome realization hit. The deceased was a member of their own fire station. It didn't take long to ID the victim after that. It was one of their younger members, and everyone was distraught about it. Not only did they have to deal with the cleanup of such a horrific death, but they had to deal with the guilt. Why did he do such a thing? Were there any signs that he had given earlier that they had all missed? Was there anything that they could have done to prevent it? My husband knew the young man, and he never realized that he was in that state of mind. None of the other volunteers at the firehouse did either. They would have done anything for their friend had they known. Some of the firefighters who responded to the call ended up with PTSD. What they saw that day was bad enough, but knowing the person added an extra punch in their guts. Everyone was traumatized, and I understand why. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Special shout out to all of you who volunteer as firefighters or EMTs, EMS, whatever you want to refer to it as. We are all indebted to you. And to everyone out there, if your local volunteer fire department is ever doing a fundraiser or fund drive, make sure you support them. These are the men and women that can come and save your ass if something goes wrong. Don't be a cheapskate. Help them out. If you like what you've heard and you're viewing this on YouTube, why not give the video a thumbs up? Leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of the stories. If you haven't subscribed, why not? And maybe even tell a friend about the channel. Follow me on social media. And of course, if you'd like to take your support of what I'm doing a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, or consider purchasing some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my storefront on tpublic.com is in the description as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.